It's not 60 minutes, it's 60 seconds. And that's all the time you need to accomplish quite a bit when you're practicing. We're going to talk about that next. Hello and welcome to the Musician Toolkit, episode number 76. My name is David Lane, and it is great to be with you once again. So, off the top of my head, I think this is the fifth solo episode in a row that I've done. And, if you listen to all the episodes of the podcast, if you have for a while, I just want to go ahead and say right away, no, this is not becoming one of those podcasts where everything is going to be a solo episode. I did mention at the first of the year that I thought it was quite reasonable that 2/3 of the episodes this year would probably be solo episodes. I would be doing fewer guests, but I didn't mean to go so many in a row, and it's probably going to be another 1 or 2 solo episodes before we get the next guest in here. Not to bore you with details, but just it's been a busy time for me and potential guests. Had a hard time kind of making a schedule that benefited both of us to get some guests recorded, but certainly do have some people I want to have back on the show. In the meantime, I hope you enjoy the solo episodes as they come up on this podcast. If you're new to this show, the main focus of this podcast is that we talk about the craft of musicianship. In my personal life, I compose, I play piano, and I help people who are learning piano and learning how to compose, how to become better masters of their craft. And from the time I was a freshman in college and around other aspiring professional musicians for really the first time in my life at that point, I've always been fascinated in what goes into crafting the musician. There's this mystique, I think especially among non-musicians, that musicians and other artists are these very creative, emotional people. And that any success that they have is through some combination of teaching, just an insane amount of practice time, and of course, natural talent. Back on episode 2 of this podcast, I shared my feelings on what I thought about the word talent at the time. I feel like since then I should probably revisit that because I've maybe tempered some of my thoughts at the time. I do think that there is a lot to talent that you do have to have as a baseline to be a musician. I'll save that for a future episode. I think that's something that I want to revisit at some point. You certainly need to practice, but maybe you don't need to practice as much as you think to make a lot of progress. This is something that I tell my students all the time. Practice frequency is more important than practice duration. And practice quality or practice strategy is more important than practice duration. Practice duration only becomes a factor in measuring how well you'll do if you have already done as well as you can on the first 2. In other words, if you're practicing every day, or as many days as you can, that's one of the first things you should try to do. And then once you're doing that, you need to have a plan for how to spend that time most efficiently and most productively. If you do that for 10 minutes, you'll be way ahead of the person practicing for an hour who doesn't have much of a plan other than to sit down and practice something. But I'm also fascinated how musicians that go on to be professionals, that become successful, they're not the ones that are complaining about having to learn music theory and having to learn music history. But instead, they're actually fascinated in those subjects. They love learning about orchestration. They love ear training. They love learning about sight reading. And these are just a few of the skills that we talk about. And today, once again, we're going to be talking about a strategy that's good for when you're practicing. So no doubt you noticed the title of today's episode in your podcast feed before you press play says the 1-minute practice challenge. So this episode will be longer than 1 minute. Pretty sure it's already been longer than 1 minute so far. But I don't suspect it'll be a very long episode because it is about a single practice tip today. And again, that tip is called the 1-minute practice challenge. So let me give you just a little bit of background of how I came up with this and where it comes from. It's actually an expression that I coined for the first time this year, in a lesson. Now, it's a more extreme kind of way of focusing from something that I have taught for years, and that is the idea of if you are practicing on something that is challenging but not overwhelming. In other words, it's not something you can sight read well, but at the same time, it's not something that, you're really reaching to try to learn this piece. It's not something where if, let's just say compare something like the Keith Snell repertoire series, that has 10 levels. It's not like you've been practicing on level 3 and now you're trying to learn something on level 9. But, instead you're trying to learn something on level 3, 4, or maybe even 5. So if you take that scenario, what I see quite often, and I feel like this is the natural approach for most students until they are coached otherwise, is to start at the beginning and try to keep playing to the end. And then next time they sit down, start at the beginning and keep trying to play to the end. And then repeat. Just rinse and repeat. Try to keep taking this same thing, and which I always say is the equivalent of taking your plate of food at dinner, lifting that plate up and dumping the whole thing in your mouth and swallowing it whole. I always like to suggest, you probably will enjoy that meal better if first you chop it into bite-sized portions, and then do you take those bite-sized portions and then swallow them whole? No, you chew on them. You chew on them till it is easy enough to swallow. And a lot of dietitians, a lot of nutritionists will say that one thing a lot of us do quite a bit is we swallow a little early when it comes to chewing our food. There's at least one coach out there that says you should chew it until it's basically liquid, until there's nothing left to chew. And, which is supposedly, better for your colon, better for, just the digestive process. And while I'm sure it's unreasonable to expect that there's a direct connection between nutrition, eating, and practicing, I think we can understand the same thing. What we're trying to do with music is we're trying to digest it. We're trying to get to where we understand the music, and you don't do that several pages at a time. And even if you're a beginner and your music is 16 measures long, you don't do that 16 measures at a time. So what should you practice? Well, what I've said before, back to this whole scenario, if you're playing something on a level that challenges you but does not overwhelm you, I have found that on average, and certainly don't take this figure to be absolute, each piece is different. I'm just going to say if you probably took 10 such pieces and figured out the average, some more, some less, I think you would find that you should allot 5 minutes of practice for every 2 measures of music. And what I think's going to happen if you do it that way, if you approach that, if you took, say, 5 minutes to work on just 2 measures, I think you would find that after about 3 minutes, you're feeling like you are getting it down. But the next 2 minutes is what gives you that cushion, that sense of familiarity, that feeding it to your subconscious that allows you to really feel like you have accomplished something in the music. Now, there's ways to approach that. If you consider that, well, you could work on a 4-measure section for 10 minutes, or you could work on an 8-measure section for 20 minutes. So there's, it depends on your comfort level and, what you feel is the best approach for you. And, certainly what your teacher feels is the best approach for you is what I would go with. Well, I have one student, I'm not going to call him out. It's been with me for a long time. And I felt like even this year, every single piece, with few exceptions, he was really struggling to get to this sense of familiarity. We're playing a piece, we're getting to a point where we've learned something from it, but we're not really knowing it. And I've gone through the usual things like reminding him, asking him, what is the point of practicing music? And to me, the number one reason to practice music is to become more familiar with the music. I kind of compare it to if you meet somebody and you're told to get to know them and you have 5 minutes to do it. Or let's come back to this sense of this podcast. Let's say you have 1 minute to do it. You have 1 minute to get to know this person. Well, you think about what are all the things that you could ask? You could ask them their name, and you might want to do that more than once, make sure that you have it. You can ask them, when is their birthday? How old are they? Did they grow up in the town where you are, or Do they have another hometown? How many brothers and sisters do they have, or are they an only child? You could ask all kinds of things, and obviously the more time you have to ask and the more time you have to listen, and of course the more you pay attention while you're doing that, the more familiar you are going to become with this person. Learning music requires that you spend a lot of time with repetition, but also paying attention, asking yourself. I always say this, there's 3 senses involved in learning music. You have to ask yourself, what does this look like when I'm playing it correctly? And that can be, what does it look like on the sheet music as I'm playing? What does it look like in my hands, or whatever the focal point of actually making the music is for you, for vocalists, and maybe mouth placement. What does it sound like when I'm playing it correctly? And what I think is maybe the most underrated but most powerful of all of them is, what does it feel like when I'm playing this correctly? What does it feel like as I'm playing this music and making it? And it takes time to focus on that, and you can't do that if you're just playing through these giant sections. And so what you get, like with my student, when this is your approach to practice, is just kind of play through and hope it gets better and not really pay attention to the senses. You're not really getting familiar with it. You're coming to the lesson having practiced, but you have to stop, look at the note, think about it, play it, look at the next note, think about it, play it. And it literally has been that for more pieces than it hasn't been. So we've made some progress this year, and what I decided to challenge him with, I thought, I want to get really extreme. I want him to understand it really doesn't take as much as you think. And it's called the 1 minute practice challenge. And this is the challenge. You take out a stopwatch on your phone or wherever, or a clock hanging on the wall, and you time yourself for 60 seconds while you practice. Now, before you begin counting the seconds, or actually you don't really want to count the seconds consciously, you want to have them monitored, that's why I say a stopwatch is good, or a countdown timer, something that'll go off after 1 minute. Before you do that, look at the music and decide, what can you improve dramatically in 1 minute? Is it 2 measures? Is it 1 measure? Is it going from one chord to another? Is it just going to a tabletop, or just, pretending to hold your instrument and working on just the rhythm, or working on just the fingerings? Think about, what is it that you can do for 1 minute to get better? Then put that timer on and work on just that for 1 minute, nothing else. Even if it starts to feel easy, stick with that for 1 minute. One thing's going to happen, you're going to get a better feel for what you actually can do in a minute. And, you might try this the first time or two, and you overestimated what you can do. And you realize, okay. So what do you do then? Well, you take another minute and you work on the same thing. Or you say, let me work on half of that. If you were trying to do a measure and it was too much, let's take 2 beats. So repeat that for at least 5, preferably 10 minutes. Take a 10-minute session and don't think of what can I do in 10 minutes. Think of what can you do in 10 single minutes. Minute 1 is better than minute 0. Minute 2 is better than minute 1. Minute 3 is better than minute 2. Minute by minute, you're getting better. This is an incredible sense of dopamine, by the way. I have experienced practice, especially as a student in the past, where I would practice for 30, 45 minutes, sometimes an hour, and not really be sure if I improved very much, or be disappointed in how little I did improve. And it never occurred to me at that time that I should be practicing in such a way that each minute I sit down is getting better. Now, if you've been at music for a while and you think, that sounds a little extreme, do I have to really practice in such a way that each minute gets better at a time? Not necessarily. If you are comfortable with practicing and you feel like you know how to practice to consistently improve what you're working on every time you sit down, well, that confidence goes a long way. You can think in terms of 5 or even 10 minutes at a time. I'm going to work on a section knowing that if I practice something for 10 minutes, for example, that after 6 or 7 minutes, I may not be feeling that confident that things are improving, but I know myself well enough, I know what I'm able to practice, and I know that after 10 minutes, it's going to be a lot better. So you can do that. But what I suggest is if you have been practicing and you have not been seeing consistent improvement, and that's an important thing because you can always have good practice days. But if you're having bad practice days about as often, then that means we don't have a consistent approach to learning. So if that sounds like you, I encourage you to start extreme. Take what you can do in 1 minute. By the way, this applies to learning your notes. If you go to some place like I recommend, like musictheory.net, to their exercises page, you can also do this on iPad or iPhone with the Tenuto app, going to the note identification, setting up the notes that you're trying to learn. If you're trying to get better at your notes, what's a way that you can improve a lot in 1 minute? Well, this is very easy. If you're trying to learn, say, an entire staff or 2 staves worth of notes, you're not going to get better at trying to go over all of those notes in 1 minute. But in the settings, where it asks you what is the range of the notes that you would like to work on, if you'll put those notes closer together and work on just 3, 4, or 5 notes and go through them over and over, you can go through quite a few in 1 minute. And you're going to get to where you know those pretty well. So then you move that range around and you try another 3 or 4 or 5 notes, or you add maybe 2 new notes to the mix for the second minute. And then you add maybe 1 or 2 new notes to the mix for the third minute. And before you know it, you are getting better and better, and you're compounding your success minute by minute. So start with the idea of 1 minute. And then if you want, change it to 2 minutes or 3 minutes. And then get yourself to 5 minutes, to where you're thinking about practice at 5 minutes at a time. The time when it's right to go on is when you've mastered one, when you can confidently predict, I'm going to be dramatically better at something after each single minute of practice. Then you can change the scale of measurement. You can work your way up to 5 minutes at a time. So that is to say you can work on a section large enough that after 1 or 2 minutes, you may not be feeling a lot better about it. But after 5 minutes, you certainly will. And you find where you can confidently do that. And then you find where you can confidently do 10 minutes at a time. Now, I would never practice in a way that I don't feel better. I don't even do 10 minutes. I have a 5-minute standard. I don't like practicing for more than 5 minutes without feeling like I have dramatically improved something. And there are times I'll work on a piece if it's a bit of a stretch, I may work on something in such a way that it is a 1 minute challenge for me or a 2 minute challenge. I'm going to work on something to get better at this for 1 or 2 minutes. So what is something out there that I haven't mentioned that you could practice implementing the 1 minute challenge rule to get a lot better? And if you try this, I would love to hear from you how it's going. Send me your reports. Tell me with your voice, if you wouldn't mind, at speakpipe.com/musiciantoolkit. Or if you want, feel free to send me a message at my website at davidlanemusic.com, where you can also find all of the past episodes of this podcast if you click on the Musician Toolkit or type in davidlanemusic.com/toolkit. And you can also send me a message on social media apps like Instagram, I'm at David Lane Music, or Facebook at David M. Lane Music. Well, that's going to wrap up today's episode. Please share this with a friend. Share it on your social media feeds. It means so much in helping this podcast to grow and to reach new listeners who might find value in improving their overall musicianship. Thank you once again for listening, and I'll be back with you again next week.